She won 2 Academy Awards, started a fitness empire, and became one of the most controversial women in America. She marched against wars, got arrested outside the Capitol at 81, and has been reinventing herself for more than 6 decades without ever quite stopping. But underneath all of it, underneath the awards and the causes and the aerobics videos and the mugshot, is a woman who spent decades in marriages that she later described as forms of disappearing. Not violent marriages, not dramatic Hollywood meltdowns. Something quieter and in certain ways more revealing than either of those things. This is the story of Jane Fonda's 3 marriages. Why she chose the men she chose, what she gave up inside each of them, and what she found when she finally chose herself. The father who cast the shadow. Before Roger Vadim, before Tom Hayden, before Ted Turner, before any of the 3 marriages that defined the chapters of Jane Fonda's adult life, there was Henry. Henry Fonda was one of the most celebrated actors in American history. He played Abraham Lincoln for John Ford. He played Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath. He played the juror who changes everything in 12 Angry Men. He played Frank in Once Upon a Time in the West. He was a man whose face the entire country associated with a particular kind of quiet moral authority. The decent man, the principled man, the American who stands up when standing up costs something. The specific quality of his screen presence, a stillness, a restraint, an emotional precision that communicated tremendous feeling through very small movements, made him one of the most trusted and admired performers in Hollywood history. Off-screen, he was famously remote, not cold in the way of people who don't feel things. Everyone who knew him understood that Henry Fonda felt things deeply. But communicating those feelings to the people closest to him was something he found genuinely difficult. He was emotionally walled off in the specific way of men of his generation and his formation. Men who had been taught that feeling too much was a form of weakness, and that the people who loved you could be trusted to understand your love without being told about it. The people who loved Henry Fonda were often not certain they were loved. His children were among them. Jane Seymour Fonda was born on December 21, 1937, in New York City, the first child of Henry Fonda and his second wife, Frances Ford Seymour. She grew up in a household organized around her father's enormous professional reputation and his equally enormous emotional unavailability. Henry was not a man who told his children he loved them with any regularity. He communicated his values through work and through a standard of excellence that he applied to himself and, implicitly, to the people around him, including the daughter who watched him carefully and absorbed everything she could about what he expected from a woman. His standard for female beauty was explicit and damaging. He told Jane, when she was still a child, that she had a problem with her weight. He communicated, through remarks that she remembered for the rest of her life, that her physical appearance fell short of what it should be. This was not casual thoughtlessness. It was the specific opinion of the person whose opinion mattered most, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who did not understand the force it would carry. It landed in Jane with the weight of a directive. She later disclosed publicly that she struggled with bulimia for more than 2 decades, the eating disorder beginning in her teenage years and not fully resolved until she was in her 40s. The connection between her father's expressed standards and the disorder that followed them was one she made explicitly in her memoir, My Life So Far, and in multiple interviews over the subsequent years. Frances Ford Seymour, Jane's mother, died when Jane was 12 years old. The death was the result of self-inflicted harm, though Jane was not told the truth about the circumstances until she was a teenager and the manner in which the news was concealed from her. She initially learned only that her mother had died, and the full story emerged later through a magazine article. added a layer of bewildering confusion to the bereavement that was already enormous. Her mother had been a beautiful and troubled woman whose marriage to Henry had been, by most accounts, a difficult one. Jane grew up carrying both the loss and the specific way the loss had been handled. The family's insistence on a version of events that was cleaner and more manageable than the truth. Henry married 4 more times after Francis's death. Jane grew up watching her father choose and lose and choose again. She watched him remain fundamentally himself through all of it, private, demanding, morally serious in his professional life, emotionally guarded in his personal one. She absorbed the lesson, without entirely knowing she was absorbing it, that this was what a powerful and significant man looked like. That this was the shape that mattered. She went to Vassar College, drifted through a period of directionless young adulthood, and found her way to the Actors Studio in New York, where Lee Strasberg was teaching the method approach to performance that was transforming American theatre. There, for the first time, she encountered a world that took her interior life seriously, that treated what a person felt and how they accessed it as something of genuine value. She began to find the beginnings of herself. And then she met Roger Vadim. Roger Vadim, the director who wanted a statue. Roger Vadim was 32 years old and already famous when Jane Fonda met him in Paris in 1963. He was French, seductive, intellectually dazzling in the specific mode of the French cinematic intelligentsia, and he had a particular gift. He knew how to look at a woman in a way that made the woman feel she had never been properly seen before. He had done this with Brigitte Bardot, whom he had discovered and married and made into an international sex symbol in the 1950s. He had done it with Annette Streuberg and Catherine Spark. Jane Fonda was, in certain respects, the next in a sequence, though understanding this required a distance and a clarity that she did not have at 25, meeting him for the first time. She knew this, or she knew it later. At the time, the attention of a man like Roger Vadim, the sophistication, the European ease, the directorial eye that transformed the women around him into images of extraordinary power, was something she found genuinely irresistible. She had grown up in the shadow of a father who withheld approval, who communicated love through silence and standards. Here was someone who looked at her and saw, in the most visible possible way, that she was everything. The experience of being fully seen, of being the thing someone was organizing their creative life around, was one she had no particular defenses against. They married in January 1965. Jane was 27. She moved to France and into the world of European cinema and French intellectual life that Vadim inhabited. The education was genuine. She learned about film, about European culture, about ways of understanding art and sexuality and freedom that the American world she had grown up in had not provided. She became fluent in French. She met Simone de Beauvoir and Brigitte Bardot and the major figures of the French New Wave generation. She was living in one of the most culturally alive cities in the world, at one of the most culturally alive moments in its history. And the life she was living was extraordinary by any measure. Barbarella, the 1968 science fiction film that Vadim directed and Jane starred in, is the most concentrated expression of what the marriage produced and what it cost. Jane plays a futuristic adventurer in a film that prioritizes her physical presence above everything else. A film that was, and was intended to be, about making Jane Fonda into a specific kind of image for a mass audience. The film was commercially successful. It made Jane's body famous in a way that her previous films had not. It also placed her, permanently and uncomfortably, in a category that she would spend the rest of her career trying to transcend. Their daughter, Vanessa Vadim, was born in September 1968. Jane has described the period of the Vadim marriage in interviews with a combination of genuine complexity and characteristic directness. She has said that she spent those years trying to become what Vadim wanted her to be, that she adopted his sexual politics, his social philosophy, his vision of what a liberated woman looked like, and that the adoption was, gradually and then completely, an erasure of the person she might otherwise have become. She described fitting herself into the shape he had in mind for her. She described losing track of where his preferences ended and her own began. She has also acknowledged, in the same interviews, that the marriage gave her things that were genuinely valuable. She was in Paris, in the world of European cinema, moving through the cultural life of a city that was at the center of a profound cultural revolution. She was meeting filmmakers and writers and intellectuals whose work was reshaping the world. The education she received in Vadim's world was real. The cost of that education was also real. By the early 1970s, the world was changing rapidly in ways that made the Vadim marriage's specific values increasingly incompatible with where Jane was going. The Vietnam War was consuming American consciousness. The civil rights movement had transformed what political engagement meant. Women across the country were beginning to think differently about the structures that shaped their lives. Jane Fonda was watching all of this, and something in her was responding to it with an urgency that the aesthetic world of Roger Vadim's cinema had no room for. Vadim died in 2000, at the age of 72, following a battle with cancer. Jane attended his funeral, an act consistent with the genuine warmth that she expressed about the marriage, even in accounts that were honest about its costs. She said that she was grateful for what he had given her, and that she had loved him, and that both of those things could be true, alongside the rest of the account. Roger Vadim had been, in the specific and bounded way of people who occupy a defined role in your story, exactly what he had been. Her divorce from Vadim was finalized in January 1973. 3 days later, she married Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden, the cause that became a marriage? Tom Hayden was, by any measure, one of the most significant political figures of the American left in the latter half of the 20th century. He had been one of the principal authors of the Port Huron Statement in 1962, the foundational document of Students for a Democratic Society, which articulated a vision of participatory democracy that shaped a generation's political thinking in the same way that earlier foundational documents had shaped earlier generations. He had been a central figure in the civil rights movement, traveling to the South and participating in voter registration efforts when that work carried genuine physical risk. He had traveled to Hanoi during the Vietnam War, meeting with North Vietnamese officials, an act that made him, in the eyes of significant portions of the American public, a traitor, and in the eyes of others, a genuine peace advocate working through the only channels available. He was also a member of the Chicago Seven, the group of activists charged with conspiring to incite a riot at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, charges that arose from the police violence against demonstrators outside the convention center. The trial that followed was one of the most theatrical and politically charged legal proceedings in American history, with Judge Julius Hoffman presiding over a courtroom where one defendant, Bobby Seale, was literally bound and gagged. Hayden and his co-defendants were ultimately acquitted of the conspiracy charges. The prosecution was widely understood as an attempt to criminalize political opposition through the legal system. Jane Fonda met Tom Hayden in the summer of 1972, while she was already deeply engaged in anti-war activism. She had been traveling to military bases as part of the FTA tour, Free the Army, a theatrical troupe she helped organize as a counter to the USO shows, appearing at anti-war rallies and building the political network that would sustain her advocacy for the next decade. She had also, in 1972, made the decision to travel to Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, where she was photographed sitting on a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun. The photograph, smiling, appearing to aim the weapon, became one of the most controversial images of the entire Vietnam War era, earning her the nickname Hanoi Jane and the permanent enmity of a significant portion of the American public that has never fully dissipated in the decades since. She has described the photograph as a mistake, that she sat where she was gestured to sit without thinking about how the image would read, and that the appearance it created of cheerfully participating in a weapon pointed at American planes was something she deeply regrets. The relationship between Jane and Tom developed from the political work before it became romantic. They shared a vision of what America should be and a willingness to pay the cost of pursuing it, including the cost of being publicly despised for doing so. They married in January 1973, 3 days after Jane's divorce from Vadim was finalized. She was 3 months pregnant with their son Troy when they married. Troy Garrity was born in July 1973. He took a family name different from his father's, a practical acknowledgement of how politically charged the Hayden name was in American public life. In 1982, Jane and Tom adopted a teenager named Mary Luana Williams, whose biological parents had been members of the Black Panther Party. The family they built together was rooted in the values they shared, and it was, by the accounts of the people who knew it from the inside, a genuine family rather than a performed one. The marriage lasted 17 years. The work they did together in those years was real and consequential. They founded the Campaign for Economic Democracy, a California-based political organization that pursued progressive policy goals across multiple issue areas. Tom Hayden was eventually elected to the California State Assembly and then to the California State Senate, serving for 18 years in the California legislature. Jane's fitness empire, the Jane Fonda workout series that she launched in 1982, was partly conceived as a fundraising mechanism for the political work. The first workout video, which launched a genre and an industry, was released to support the Campaign for Economic Democracy financially. The 17 million copies sold across the series generated money that funded real political work. But underneath the shared work, something was missing. Jane has described the Hayden marriage with the same honest self-examination that characterizes her account of all 3 marriages. She describes having reorganized herself around Tom's political identity, around his causes, his campaigns, his vision of what mattered and what should be pursued. She describes having become, functionally, a fundraiser and a public spokesperson for the political project that Tom Hayden led. She describes losing the thread of her own identity in the same way that she had lost it with Vadim. Differently, with entirely different content, but through the same mechanism of submerging herself in someone else's world. The estrangement between them began in the mid-1980s as Tom's political direction shifted and as the specific shared urgency of the activist years found different expression in their respective lives. They were formally divorced in 1990. Tom Hayden married Barbara Williams in 1993, a marriage that lasted until his death in 2016 at the age of 76, following a stroke. Jane attended his memorial service and spoke about him with warmth. She has said that the work was right and the politics were right. What was wrong was the pattern. The workout, the fame, and the years between. Between the end of the Hayden marriage in 1990 and the beginning of the Turner marriage in 1991, there is something important to understand about who Jane Fonda was professionally and publicly, because the marriages are easier to understand in the context of who she was when she entered each of them. The Jane Fonda workout video, released in 1982, changed American culture in ways that are still difficult to fully measure. It launched the home fitness industry as a genuinely mass phenomenon. It made the VHS tape a domestic staple in American homes for the first time. The workout video was among the earliest killer applications for home video technology, the thing that made people buy the machines. It sold more than 17 million copies across the series that followed the original release and generated revenue on a scale that no political organization of the American left had ever previously commanded. The Campaign for Economic Democracy, the political organization Jane and Tom had built, was transformed financially by the proceeds. The cultural reach of the workout phenomenon was also transformative for Jane's public image in ways that were complicated and interesting. She had been, for a decade, primarily a political figure in the public's imagination. The woman who had gone to Hanoi, the activist who had organized military base tours in opposition to the Vietnam War, the person who had been called a traitor by people who found her activism unacceptable. The workout videos placed her in American living rooms as a fitness instructor, cheerful and energetic and aggressively healthy, in a way that was entirely disconnected from the political figure. Both Jane Fonda's, the political one and the fitness one, were real. The American public's ability to hold both simultaneously was, in its own way, a remarkable cultural phenomenon. She had won her first Academy Award in 1972 for Clute, her performance as a New York call girl in a thriller directed by Alan J. Pakula, a performance of such genuine psychological complexity that the industry recognized it as something exceptional. She won her second in 1979 for Coming Home, the Vietnam War drama that she had helped develop, that starred Jon Voight as a paralyzed veteran. And that reflected directly the political commitments of her Hayden years. She received additional nominations for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? In 1969, and Julia in 1978. The career was not a celebrity career, orbiting around one performance. It was a sustained body of work produced across 2 decades by someone who had trained seriously and who brought genuine intelligence and commitment to the material. She was also, during the Hayden years, the most commercially successful fitness figure in American history. A status that coexisted with the political controversy in ways that defied the usual categories. And she was, in On Golden Pond in 1981, present in the most personally significant film of her career. The film she had produced specifically to create the opportunity for her and her father to work together, to occupy the same frame together, to be seen by the world as father and daughter in a way that the private father-daughter relationship had never allowed. Henry Fonda won the Academy Award for Best Actor for On Golden Pond. It was the only Academy Award of his career. He died 5 months after the film was released. The film is their permanent, publicly available reconciliation. She was, in 1990, 52 years old, and one of the most complex public figures in American life. She was finishing one marriage and about to begin another. The pattern she would later name was about to repeat itself once more, in the most extravagant setting yet. Ted Turner. Billions, big sky, and a different kind of disappearing. Ted Turner was unlike either of Jane Fonda's previous husbands in almost every measurable way. He was not an artist. He was not an activist in the intellectual tradition that Tom Hayden represented. He was a businessman, one of the most consequential businessmen of the 20th century, the man who had founded CNN and essentially invented 24-hour cable news, who owned the Atlanta Braves and the Atlanta Hawks baseball and basketball franchises, who had donated $1 billion to the United Nations in a single gesture of philanthropy, who owned more land in the United States than any other private individual. He was not the world of European cinema or the world of American political theory. He was the world of American capitalism and American ambition at their most extravagant and most exuberant. A man who raced sailboats, managed sports franchises, and funded environmental causes with the same relentless and sometimes chaotic energy. He was also, by the accounts of the people who knew him well, a genuinely compelling personality, charismatic, unpredictable, capable of great generosity and great self-absorption simultaneously, a man of enormous energy and enormous needs. He had been married twice before Jane Fonda, to Judy Nye, and then to Jane Shirley Smith. He had 5 children from his previous marriages. His personal and professional lives were both characterized by a bigness that was hard to stand next to without feeling diminished. They married on December 21st, 1991, Jane's birthday, at his Flying D ranch in Montana. The ceremony was held on his land, in the specific grandeur of the American West that Turner had made his private landscape. Jane stepped into a world that was physically larger than anything she had previously inhabited. The Montana ranch, the properties across the American West, the private planes, the bison herds that Turner was raising as part of his environmental commitment, the specific quality of billionaire existence that makes everything else look modest. She also stepped into the specific challenge of being Ted Turner's wife. Ted Turner was a man whose emotional needs were enormous and whose fidelity was, by documented accounts, inconsistent. Jane has described, in interviews and in her memoir, the specific moment she discovered he had been unfaithful, very shortly after the wedding, and her response, which included a heated confrontation involving a telephone. The incident is documented in her public statements. She stayed in the marriage, and she has reflected on why, the scale of what Turner represented, the shared interests in environmental causes and media and global philanthropy, the physical beauty of the life, the specific force of a personality that was difficult to simply walk away from. She has also acknowledged that the familiar pattern was operating. Turner was dominating in the same way that Vadim had been dominating and Hayden had been dominating, differently in every specific detail, but through the same structural dynamic. A powerful man with a powerful vision of what the world should be and what his life should look like, and Jane organizing herself around that vision at the cost of the self that existed independent of it. She stopped acting during the Turner years. She retired from film in 1990, just before the marriage, after a run of commercially unsuccessful pictures. She did not return to acting for 15 years. The woman who had made Clute and Coming Home and The China Syndrome and On Golden Pond, the film she had made with her father Henry Fonda in his final year, the film that had finally broken something open between them, was not making films during the Ted Turner decade. She was being Ted Turner's wife. In her memoir, My Life So Far, published in 2005, she described this period with the most direct language she had used about any of her marriages. She described looking in a mirror one day during the Turner years and not recognizing the person looking back at her. She described the realization that she had done what she had done before, more completely than she had done it before, that she had once again disappeared inside someone else's life. The clarity of the recognition was, by her account, the beginning of the end. They divorced in May 2001. The settlement was reported to be in the range of $100 million in cash, stock, and real estate. Ted Turner, who revealed in 2018 that he had been living with Lewy body dementia, did not remarry after the divorce. He died on May 6, 2026, at the age of 87. Jane Fonda returned to acting in 2005 with Monster-in-Law, and the career she had paused resumed as if the pause had been a strategic decision rather than a disappearing act. What she said about all of it. Jane Fonda has been, across the decades since her third divorce, among the most consistently honest public figures about her own psychology and the patterns she has lived. This honesty is not the performance of honesty, not the calculated vulnerability of a celebrity managing her image through strategic disclosure. It is the specific, sustained, sometimes uncomfortable honesty of someone who has done genuine psychological work and who has decided to share what she found, because the sharing might be useful to someone else who recognizes themselves in it. She has described all three marriages through the same frame: a woman who grew up organizing herself around her father's approval, who then spent 40 years organizing herself around whichever man she was married to, who kept losing herself in the shape of another person's life, and then gradually finding her way back, only to lose herself again with the next person. She has connected this pattern directly to Henry Fonda. She has said that she always thought she wanted to find someone unlike her father, someone warmer, more expressive, more emotionally available than the remote and demanding man who had raised her. And she has said, with the rueful clarity of someone who has examined this carefully, that in the ways that actually mattered, all three men she married were like him. She has said this explicitly in interviews. All three men had difficulty with emotional intimacy. All three dominated the space around them. All three required, in their different ways, that the people close to them organize themselves around their needs and their visions. She chose 3 times a version of the same person. The bulimia that began in her teenage years, the eating disorder that she connected directly to her father's remarks about her body, stayed with her through all three marriages. She went public about it in the 1980s, in the specific act of honesty that is difficult when the person you're describing is a parent you loved and who was also causing you harm. She said she kicked it in her 40s, describing it as one of the most significant things she ever did for herself. Not the political activism or the film career or the workout empire, but stopping the specific pattern of self-destruction that her father's standards had initiated in her as a child, and that she had carried through 3 marriages and 30 years of adult life. She has also said, in multiple interviews across the past 2 decades, that she found herself only after the third marriage ended, that she was 63 years old when she first began to live as herself rather than as the person a husband had shaped her into being. That this realization arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual, persistent, ultimately undeniable recognition of who she was when the external structure fell away. That the subsequent years, the return to acting, the return to activism, the relationship with record producer Richard Perry that lasted from 2009 to 2017, had been the best years of her life, not in spite of being lived increasingly on her own terms, but because of it. She has been asked by various interviewers whether she regrets the marriages. Her answer has been consistent. No, not exactly. She believes she needed to go through them in the order she went through them. She believes each one gave her something real. Vadim gave her Europe and cinema and the education of the French artistic world. Hayden gave her politics and the experience of working towards something genuinely important. Turner gave her the American West and the scale of a life organized around big ambitions. What she paid, all 3 times, was herself. And she has said that the price was too high, and that knowing it was too high is something she had to arrive at through the experience, rather than being told about it in advance. The pattern she named. What Jane Fonda has done, in her sustained and public examination of her own marriages, is something that is rarer in public life than it should be. She has named the pattern clearly, without excusing it and without excessive self-condemnation. The pattern is a woman shaped by a demanding and withholding father, who spent her adult life choosing men who replicated that dynamic, who kept disappearing inside their worlds and then finding her way back, who needed to do this 3 full times across 36 years before she understood what she was doing and stopped. Each husband represented a different version of the same thing. Vadim gave her Europe and cinema and the specific education of the French artistic world. Hayden gave her politics and activism, and the sustained experience of working towards something that actually mattered. Turner gave her the American West and the scale of a billion-dollar life, and the specific grandeur of someone who had genuinely changed the world through force of will. These were real things. The people she married were, whatever their limitations, genuinely significant human beings who did real things in the world. What they also were, and this is the thread that runs through all three, was men who needed to be the center. Men whose world was large enough, forceful enough, to absorb whoever entered it. Men for whom the women they chose were supporting figures in a story whose protagonist was always themselves. This is not a unique pattern. It is, in fact, a pattern that millions of women have recognized in their own lives when they encounter it in someone else's account. The specificity of Jane Fonda's version, the famous father, the Hollywood marriages, the political activism, the billion-dollar settlement, is particular to her. The underlying structure is not. She has described herself, in the years since the Turner divorce, as finally knowing who she is. She has said that she likes herself, which she frames as something that took most of a lifetime to achieve. She has said that she would not trade the experience of the marriages because she needed them to become the person she became. She has also said that she is stronger than all the men she married. She says this not as a boast, but as a fact that she arrived at slowly and that she holds carefully. The life after the last husband. Jane Fonda returned to acting in 2005 and did not stop. Monster-in-Law in 2005, Georgia Rule in 2007, the television series The Newsroom, a return to Broadway in 2009 in 33 variations, for which she received a Tony Award nomination for Best Actress in a Play, 46 years after her last Broadway appearance. And then, from 2015 to 2022, Grace and Frankie on Netflix, the comedy series about two women whose husbands leave them for each other, which became one of the most watched Netflix series of its era and which ran for 7 seasons. Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin became, through this series, among the oldest lead actresses in the history of American television. They were the center of the show. They were the reason people watched. The industry that had once managed Jane Fonda as a physical image in Barbarella was now making hit television about two women in their 80s. And the two women in their 80s were Jane Fonda. She was arrested in October 2019, at the age of 81, outside the United States Capitol, while participating in a climate protest she organized called Fire Drill Fridays. She was arrested again the following week, and the week after that, and the week after that. She did this, consistently, for several weeks in a row, until the coronavirus pandemic ended the in-person demonstrations. She wore a red coat for most of the arrests. The same coat, worn repeatedly, which she has described as a deliberate choice to reduce her consumption, while simultaneously making herself more recognizable in the crowd. The optics of an 81-year-old Academy Award winner being handcuffed outside the Capitol in a red coat were remarkable in the specific way of things that are both absurd and completely serious at the same time. She was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma in September 2022. She announced the diagnosis publicly, consistent with the transparency that had characterized her public engagement for decades. She underwent chemotherapy for 6 months. She announced in January 2023 that the cancer was in remission. She kept working through the treatment. She has continued working since. At an age when most people have long since accepted whatever life has given them, Jane Fonda is still choosing, still pushing, still refusing the version of things that the people around her would prefer she accept. The marriages were not the whole story. They were, as she has said herself, the beginning of the story that led to the version of herself she finally found. The pattern she lived through, the father who withheld, the three men who absorbed, the self that kept disappearing and returning, is not a pattern of failure. It is a pattern of a specific kind of learning that takes the time it takes, costs what it costs, and produces, eventually and at considerable expense, the person it was always building toward. She was 63 when she first began, by her own account, to live fully as herself. She has been doing it for more than 2 decades since. There are 2 Academy Awards and 17 million workout videos and a red coat and a cancer remission and a Netflix series and 40 years of political work to show for a life that contained considerably more than 3 marriages. The marriages were the chapters she needed to get through to find out what came after them. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.